The room was thick with the scent of polished wood and old power. Congressional hearing chambers had a rhythm to them, whispers behind raised folders, the low thrum of murmured agendas, the occasional flash of media lenses peeking in from the back row. It wasn't a stage built for someone like Kash Patel, or so they thought. He entered without hesitation, his gait calm but deliberate. There was no entourage, no dramatics. Just him, a notepad under one arm, a tightly pressed suit, and the kind of stare that made even the most seasoned staffer glance twice. On the panel sat figures that had spent decades crafting their presence into institutional permanence, people who believed that walking through that door required permission. Liz Cheney looked up slowly as Kash approached the table. Her expression was unreadable at first, somewhere between contempt and curiosity. She leaned toward her microphone and, without breaking eye contact, delivered her opener in a tone that carried across the marble-floored room. "This isn't your role, Mr. Patel." There it was. No welcome, no question, just a dismissal dressed as protocol. The room shifted slightly. A few smirks, a few raised brows. Cameras adjusted their focus and aides leaned in just a little closer. But Kash didn't blink. He placed the folder on the table in front of him, opened it with care, and looked up, not at her, but at the whole room. "I didn't come here for permission," he said. "I came with facts." And in that instant, the hearing stopped being theirs. Liz Cheney's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a line that told volumes. Around her, the other committee members shifted, some feigning indifference, others openly intrigued. The script had changed before it even began. Kash Patel wasn't following the rhythm, and Washington hated unscripted performances. "Mr. Patel," Liz said with a professional chill, "we're not here for political theater." Kash leaned slightly forward, resting one hand on the folder, the other open, deliberate. "Neither am I," he replied calmly. "But if you're expecting silence, you're seated at the wrong table." The panel stirred again. Even a few reporters lifted their eyes from their notepads. Kash's tone wasn't angry, wasn't loud, but it carried that rare conviction that punches harder than shouting. He wasn't there to be polite. He was there to be heard. Behind the rows of lawmakers, a gallery of press and aides watched with mounting tension. Everyone knew Kash was polarizing. To some, he was a whistleblower. To others, a partisan hammer. But today, he didn't come to wear either costume. He came to rewrite the lines written in that very room. Liz attempted to regain control, tapping her pen with rehearsed authority. "If you're here to dispute the committee's findings—" "I'm here," Kash interrupted, "because truth doesn't wait for your conclusions." For a moment, the room froze. It wasn't grandstanding, it was precision. A calculated strike wrapped in restraint, and Liz Cheney knew it. Her response came slower this time, the control slipping just slightly from her voice. "You'll be heard," she said, "but you're not running this session." Kash smiled only slightly. "I don't need to run it," he said. "I just need one shot, and you just gave it to me." The lights above the chamber buzzed faintly, barely audible over the silence Kash Patel had carved out with his last words. There was a tension in the room now, not the routine kind that floats through hearings, but something denser, something waiting to snap. Liz Cheney sat back in her leather chair, posture sharp, but the steady grip on her pen betrayed the shift. This wasn't just another day of oversight and optics. Kash took his time. That silence, it was his now. He reached into the folder and pulled out a thick tabbed binder, unassuming in appearance, but heavy with implication. As he laid it on the table, the cameras zoomed in. No logos, no redactions, just a plain white label. Timeline, operations, and oversight. Liz frowned. "That document hasn't been submitted for committee review." "I know," Kash said without looking up. "That's because it was never meant to be seen." He opened the binder, page after page. Highlighted memos, email printouts, handwritten notes from meetings that never made the official record. Kash didn't just bring paperwork, he brought a counter-history, a shadow archive to the version of events the committee had spent months building. What exactly are you implying, Mr. Patel? Congressman Thompson interjected from across the panel. His voice was more annoyed than inquisitive. I'm not implying anything, Kash said, turning a page for the microphone to catch the sound. I'm stating that your timeline is missing about 17 key days, and I have them documented. Here. Cheney leaned forward now, visibly unsettled. If you're accusing this body of suppressing evidence— I'm not accusing, Kash interrupted smoothly. I'm confirming. Gasps echoed in the gallery. Journalists started typing faster. This was no longer about committee procedure or party politics. It was a public challenge. A line drawn not with outrage, but with receipts. Liz Cheney took off her glasses. It was subtle, but symbolic. She rarely did that. Mr. Patel, if this material is authentic, there are protocols, chain of custody, classification. It's all been cleared, he said, pulling another tab from the binder. Ask your own chief counsel. You've had this since April. You just didn't expect I'd bring the copy you hoped no one kept. Dead silence. Then someone in the press gallery whispered just loud enough to be heard. He just flipped the room. Kash didn't flinch. He turned another page and looked directly at Liz. You said this wasn't my role, he said, voice calm and even. But if you've all forgotten what accountability looks like, maybe someone from outside the script needs to remind you. In that moment, it didn't matter which party you belonged to. The line had been crossed, and the stage was his. For a few seconds, no one moved. The air felt heavier now, like everyone in the room was waiting for someone else to speak first. Kash sat upright, his hands calmly folded over the binder, like a professor waiting for the class to catch up. He wasn't gloating, he didn't have to. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. Liz Cheney's staff began whispering behind her. One leaned over, passing her a folded note. She read it, didn't react, and placed it quietly to the side. Whatever it said, it hadn't changed her posture. She looked at Kash with a new kind of focus. 1 part cautious respect, 2 parts political calculation. We're going to take a brief recess, Liz said, her voice clipped but steady. This committee will reconvene in 10 minutes. But Kash didn't move. Respectfully, he said, if this is an attempt to bury the moment, I'll stay right here and read every page out loud. This is public record now. Cheney paused at the edge of her seat, clearly weighing her next words with care. The usual rules didn't apply anymore. She had been prepared to manage a disruptor, not a tactician. You're welcome to do what you want, Mr. Patel, she said tightly, but this committee has procedure. That's fine, he answered. So does the Constitution. Click. That single word hung like an echo, bouncing off wood paneling and bouncing through the press row. Someone in the back started filming with their phone despite the ban. No one stopped them. The room was no longer in congressional control. It was in narrative freefall. As Cheney and the others exited, Kash stayed seated. He began reading aloud from the binder, slowly, with surgical clarity. A memo dated January 4th. A phone log from a high-level aide that contradicted public testimony. Notes from an interagency meeting that proved a particular warning wasn't just missed. It was ignored. By the time the committee returned 15 minutes later, delayed, of course, the room was entirely different. The press had called in backup. Twitter was ablaze. Headlines were forming in real time. Whistleblower, saboteur, truth-teller. The American people weren't sure yet what Kash was in that moment, but they were sure of one thing. He wasn't supposed to be there, and yet he had taken command of the room like it had been built for him. As Liz sat back down, she didn't reach for the gavel. She just looked at Kash and said, "Finish your page." He didn't smile. He didn't pause. He simply turned the next tab and said, "Gladly." The silence that followed Kash Patel's final word was not the respectful kind. It was the stunned, anticipatory hush that precedes a seismic shift. The room felt like it had cracked. The air wasn't just heavy, it was electric. On CSPAN's muted screen in waiting rooms across the country, people leaned in closer. No one was scrolling anymore. They were watching. Across from him, Liz Cheney folded her hands atop the polished oak, her brow tight. She had dealt with insubordinate witnesses, grandstanders, and even former presidents, but this was different. Kash Patel wasn't improvising, he was executing. "Mr. Patel," she began, this time with a controlled slowness that tried to rein in the moment, "you've made several claims that, if true, would suggest a deliberate failure of duty by individuals at the highest levels of government oversight." Kash nodded once, measured. "If," he repeated back at her, "but you and I both know there's no if left after page 37. The journalists present couldn't type fast enough. A third camera crew had entered the room during the recess. Even committee members who typically stayed quiet now leaned forward, eyes fixed on the binder as if it were radioactive. Cheney tried to maintain control. "We'll need to verify all of this through appropriate channels." "It's already verified," Kash replied. "Timestamps, cross-agency communications, FOIA logs. You'll find the documentation is all included. I knew this moment would come. I didn't just prepare for today, I prepared for denial." That landed hard. A few members of the gallery gasped audibly. Others exchanged glances. One aide to a Democratic representative slipped out of the room, phone pressed to their ear. Kash continued before anyone could regain footing. "You can debate my intentions. You can challenge my character. That's politics. But what you can't do, what none of you can afford to do, is ignore what's in this binder." He slid another copy, an identical one, to the edge of the table. "This one's for the public record," he added. Cheney stared at it like it was a lit stick of dynamite. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she addressed the court stenographer. "Enter Mr. Patel's documentation into the hearing log under Exhibit G." There it was, a reluctant surrender. Not an admission of guilt, not a declaration of agreement, but a recognition that the story had changed and there was no way back to the script. From the back of the room, a low murmur began to build. Staffers, reporters, even rival lawmakers whispering among themselves. They weren't discussing how to bury it, they were calculating how to survive it. Kash leaned back for the first time. His body language relaxed. He'd set the fire. Now he just had to let it burn. As the whispers turned into frantic strategy sessions behind raised folders and whispered texts, Liz Cheney realized something that sent a chill through her spine. She'd lost the room, not just physically, but narratively. In a town built on message control and optics, that kind of loss was rare and dangerous. She glanced toward the left side of the panel where Representative Gallows, a veteran Democrat with a reputation for surgical questioning, adjusted his glasses and leaned into his microphone. If anyone could regain control, it was him. "Mr. Patel," he said with polite sharpness, "you've constructed a compelling narrative, but I have to ask, what's your motive here? Why now?" Kash's expression didn't change. No irritation, no condescension, just that unnerving calm. "My motive?" he repeated. "My motive is watching this room pretend it didn't know. For years, this town has operated on selective memory and manufactured urgency. I'm here to remind it of both." The committee members exchanged glances. Gallows wasn't done. "Surely you understand how this can be perceived as partisan. Your background, your past affiliations." Kash cut him off, not rudely, but precisely. "You mean the part where I served this country? Or the part where I asked questions your committee didn't want to ask?" That line hit harder than expected. Even a few Republican members winced slightly, not because it was wrong, but because it was accurate. From the gallery, a journalist from a major network tweeted in real time, "Patel just took off the gloves. This is no longer testimony. This is a takedown." Gallows tried to pivot. "But surely even you must admit that bypassing protocol, I didn't bypass it," Kash replied. "I documented its failure." That sentence shut the room up again. He flipped to another section of the binder. I'm not here to accuse a party. I'm here to confront a pattern. We've mistaken delay for diligence. We've let committees become performance stages. Meanwhile, truths sit buried under procedural detours. The lights above flickered slightly. Or maybe it just felt that way. Liz Cheney cleared her throat, trying to recenter the session. This committee has always respected truth and transparency. Respect is easy, Kash said, eyes locked on her. Truth is harder, and transparency? That's what happens when someone's willing to lose their career to force it. The room went silent again. Not out of shock this time, but out of realization. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't posturing. He had come prepared to lose something because he believed the country had already lost more, and suddenly everyone realized they were no longer controlling the conversation. He was. The room had never felt quieter, not even in the aftermath of closed-door briefings or classified hearings. What Kash Patel had done wasn't just a challenge to the committee. It was a challenge to the very scaffolding of the political theater everyone had grown so comfortable performing in. He hadn't just entered the stage. He'd ripped out the lights and flipped the audience. And now, they were all watching. The silence broke not with a voice, but with movement. A staffer from Liz Cheney's team approached and whispered something into her ear. She didn't nod, didn't blink. She just stared straight ahead at Kash, as if studying something too dangerous to speak to directly. Finally, she turned to the room. This hearing is being suspended until further review of the evidence submitted, she said coldly. Kash leaned in slightly, calm but sharp. Suspending the hearing doesn't suspend the truth, Congresswoman. There it was, the line that lit up every newsroom in America. Within minutes, it was a chyron. A tweet, a trending topic. Suspending the hearing doesn't suspend the truth. CNN ran it with a stunned silence. Fox led the hour with it. Podcasts were already dissecting it. Across social media, political junkies, journalists, and average citizens alike replayed the clip again and again. And while the hearing officially recessed, Kash stayed. Cameras caught him packing up the binder, pausing for a single second with his hand on the cover, as if acknowledging the weight of what he'd done. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't gesture. He just turned and walked out of the room. But the moment had already ignited a firestorm. Outside the chamber, protesters and supporters alike began gathering. Some held signs calling him a patriot. Others called him a traitor. But no one was ignoring him. And in Washington, that meant one thing: he mattered. The reporters swarmed him as he exited. One question cut through the others. Mr. Patel, what happens next? He paused only briefly, then turned, looked into the lens and said, That's up to them. But if they stay silent, I won't. It was quiet but powerful. The kind of line that doesn't scream for attention because it already has it. He stepped into the black SUV waiting at the curb. No handlers, no spokesperson, just him, the binder, and a storm in his wake. And as the door shut behind him, America wasn't sure what it had just witnessed. A political statement? A whistleblower's revenge? Or the first crack in a carefully constructed illusion? Whatever it was, they knew one thing for sure: it couldn't be undone. By the time Kash Patel's SUV had merged into D.C. traffic, the response machine was already roaring to life. Offices lit up on Capitol Hill. Press secretaries drafted preliminary statements. Political advisors rang donors. Someone leaked the full binder to a journalist at the Federal Ledger before Patel even reached Constitution Avenue. Inside the White House press room, the usual calm was gone. Questions about Patel hijacked the morning briefing, forcing the spokesperson to respond with a rigid no comment and a twitch in her eye that said everything was a comment. Meanwhile, Liz Cheney was in a closed-door meeting with her staff, surrounded by folders, transcripts, and a screen playing clips of the hearing on loop. Her face was unreadable, but her silence was telling. She didn't yell, she didn't panic, she planned. "This can't go unanswered," one aide said. "It won't," she replied. "But we're not discrediting him. We're framing him." That word, framing, was deliberate. Patel hadn't lied. That was the problem. His evidence wasn't speculation. It was inconvenient fact. So if they couldn't deny the message, they'd turn the spotlight on the messenger. Within hours, op-eds appeared. Kash Patel's dangerous game. When transparency becomes a weapon. Patriot or performance artist? CNN hosted a panel dissecting his motivations. MSNBC dug into his affiliations. Fox News, on the other hand, dubbed him the whistle that Washington couldn't silence. But Kash stayed quiet. No statements, no interviews, no tweets. Until 6:17 p.m., when he posted a photo to his personal account, the Capitol Dome, the Constitution tucked under his arm, and just 4 words as the caption, "Still my country too." That one post broke the internet. The left called it theatrical. The right called it heroic. The middle called it a turning point. In homes across America, families who'd never heard the name Kash Patel were now discussing him over dinner. Young voters reposted his speech on TikTok. Retired vets quoted his line about silence not suspending the truth. And yet, amid all the noise, something else was happening. People were digging. They were reading the binder, following the footnotes, checking the references. Some were stunned, others were enraged. But none of them were passive anymore. The political machine had pushed back with every tool it had. But the people? They weren't pushing back. They were waking up. 2 days after the hearing, the steps of Capitol Hill looked more like a rally site than a government landmark. Protesters waved signs, some in support, some in fury. Defend Patel stood shoulder to shoulder with Expose the Chaos. Journalists camped out on the lawn, podcasters live-streamed. The press corps doubled in size overnight. But inside the marble corridors, something even more volatile was happening: panic. Kash Patel had unintentionally, or perhaps very intentionally, become the centerpiece of a political reckoning. The evidence he submitted couldn't be denied. Verified timestamps, cross-departmental correspondence, memos with redactions that now drew more questions than answers. What terrified lawmakers most wasn't what he said. It was how many people believed him. In a tense emergency session, senior officials from both parties met behind closed doors. Some demanded an ethics investigation into Patel. Others wanted to subpoena him again. But one voice cut through the chaos. Senator Harding, a centrist Democrat known for caution, stood up and said flatly, "If we bury this, we bury ourselves." That silence, again, heavy, inevitable. Meanwhile, Kash sat at a diner 6 blocks away, alone. No team, no cameras, just coffee and a paper copy of the Constitution that had been folded so many times it looked like a relic. The waitress asked if he was that guy on TV. He nodded once. She refilled his coffee without another word. His phone buzzed. "Newsom just went on record. So did Cruz. You're not a witness anymore. You're a symbol." Kash didn't respond. He knew. The momentum had shifted. This wasn't about committee hearings anymore. It was about a narrative war. And he wasn't just in it. He had become the front line. Back on the Hill, a new hearing date was set. But this time, it wouldn't be a quiet panel. It would be public, televised and unfiltered. And this time, both sides would come loaded for war. That evening, a rare bipartisan press conference was called. Liz Cheney and Senator Trenton stood side by side. The optics were carefully choreographed, but no one was fooled. "We are committed," Cheney said, "to uncovering the truth, wherever it leads." Kash watched the feed from his apartment. He muted the volume and just watched their faces. Not for lies, for fear, and he saw it. The day of the second hearing arrived like a storm the city had tried to ignore. The line outside the Capitol stretched 5 blocks. People weren't just watching anymore. They were showing up. Protesters stood next to veterans. College students next to retired judges. Some carried signs that said, "I read the binder." Inside the chamber, every seat was filled. Cameras lined the back wall, microphones were hot, and seated dead center, Calm, composed, binder in hand, was Kash Patel. The air wasn't tense, it was charged. When the hearing began, the chairperson skipped the formal pleasantries, no introductions, no drawn-out opening statements. This time, no one had the stomach for performance. The public was watching, and they wanted substance. A ranking member stood. "Mr. Patel, are you aware of the impact your testimony has had?" Kash didn't flinch. "I didn't come for impact. I came for accountability." "And do you still stand by everything you submitted?" "I do," he said, "and I'm prepared to answer for every page." What followed was 3 hours of back and forth that felt less like a hearing and more like a reckoning. Lawmakers asked pointed, often desperate questions. Patel responded with clarity, never raising his voice, never backing down. The binder stayed closed most of the time. He no longer needed it, because now he was the evidence. The moment that would dominate headlines came in the final stretch, when a congresswoman asked, "Mr. Patel, what do you believe the American people deserve right now?" He didn't pause. "They deserve a government that fears the people, not the other way around." Gasps, applause. From the gallery, from across the country, from living rooms and break rooms and phone screens watching in real time. The session ended not with a bang, but with something more terrifying to the political establishment. Standing ovation from the public gallery. Kash didn't smile. He just nodded once, packed up the binder, and left the chamber the way he had entered it, quietly, directly, without ceremony. By that evening, his testimony had been replayed across every major network. Editorials flipped. Critics admitted they underestimated him. Supporters flooded Capitol emails with demands for investigation, transparency, reform. In a country starving for authenticity, he had become the unexpected voice of clarity. And as the sun set over Washington, D.C., for the first time in years, people weren't talking about parties or polls. They were talking about truth. And truth, finally, was louder than politics. In a city built on spin, where words are often crafted to conceal rather than reveal, one voice cut through the noise, not with volume, but with clarity. Kash Patel didn't play their game. He flipped the board. Not to win points, but to prove a point, that the truth, when spoken without fear, is more dangerous than any lie ever whispered in power's shadow. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for applause. He simply walked in, told the story as it was, and let the facts speak louder than politics. And somehow that was enough to shake the system. This wasn't just a testimony. It was a reminder to the powerful, to the public, to anyone who ever thought the truth was too inconvenient to matter. Because at the end of the day, when the microphones go quiet, when the headlines fade, one thing remains. Truth doesn't care who's comfortable. It only cares who's listening.